My experience with video games is probably typical of teenagers who were into video games at around my age. Back then, there were three major consoles: Nintendo, Sega, and PC Engine. It was not as popular in the US, but PC Engine was actually the console that I was the most into because PC Engine had a lot of RPG games. It was not so much action-based. I was at that time living in Hong Kong, and in Hong Kong, a lot of the games that you play would be coming from Japan. And then RPG game is really the most difficult game for people to navigate if you didn't have the language. It's sort of dangerous and difficult to generalize, but the issue of translation is something that is very at the forefront of people's consciousness in a place like Hong Kong because you have different languages. When you don't understand the language, it becomes pure shapes and pure form. And you can talk about that in terms of the difficulty and the inconvenience of it, but there's also a beauty to it. It's almost like the Pythagoras curtain, right? You don't see the source, and therefore you're able to focus better on the shape of things and the formalistic aspect of things, and there's maybe beauty and advantages in that. And maybe allow me to focus on other things too. There are different sort of standard genres in video games, and RPG is a very specific genre that usually involve role-playing a character or a group of characters. And you sort of take on the persona of the character and you perform actions and conversations and you sort of live that character's life. You have to satisfy the condition of a sequence of events before the game would move on. And without understanding the language, sometimes you miss information in the conversation that makes it difficult for you to progress the game without a manual. And so there will be moments when all you can do is to try all possible permutation. And eventually something will happen. But there are also other times when it doesn't work and you're just roaming around the landscape, going from town to town. I actually kind of enjoyed that when the game is not apparently progressing. That wasn't really frustrating for me. That was somehow also fun. It's true that I often play the role of performer in my own performance-based pieces. So for example, the work that I did for About Hong Kong, it involved a character by the name of Locke who works as an engineer in this secret organization called the Ministry of Gentlemanly Warfare, and how he's installing clandestine radio signals along the coast of Hong Kong. And I have a whole backstory about where he lived, his family, what he likes, how he dresses, what time of the day he likes, all these different things. This imagination is both for me important but also pleasurable. It gave me an excuse to make up this whole fictional world. Maybe kind of like RPG game, maybe gives you just enough information to sort of fantasize about this whole bigger world. I've always had an issue with level of control and how much to give up, something that I have problem with and try to find the right balance. Scoring is notation, it's about control. It's also about this implicit power relationship, right, between the person scoring and the person executing the score. I mean, if you think about what scores are, they are instructions for action to be realized, and there's a sequential order to things. If you think about how an RPG game works, like back in those days, in terms of the programming of it, it's just branches and variables and branches and variables. And if you laid out the map of how things would progress in terms of how things are coded, it's actually very linear and maybe quite boring in some people's mind. But I'm not really deterred by boredom or labor. Like for example, when I'm doing durational pieces, I find pleasure in things that are really repetitive. I'm also not bored by practicing scales on my musical instrument, for example, which is something that some people really hate. There's pleasure and meaning to be found in repetition or in just going through the grinds. There is an optimism in that. There's no need to be goal-directed always. There's logic and pleasure and meaning to be found in the action, in the doing, in the labor. The idea of role-playing is definitely something that I continue to be interested in. And I think play and allowing for play is very important. When in situations where it's difficult to reverse the power dynamic, play opens up spaces to mess with it, and it creates a lot of openings and possibilities. Momentarily, you can create these spaces that allows for a kind of not reversal, but at least reappropriation and reshuffling of these dynamics. And then after that moment is gone, perhaps the structure that is in place, maybe they change a little bit or maybe they don't. But at least for that moment, it's been corrupted, I think that's important.